Hey there guys, it's Dr. George here, and today I wanted to share a story by Peter Casciarelli. And this is a fairy tale that had been rewritten for gay men. This is a book that I've actually had since I was 18, and I've always loved this book. And I thought today was a good chance to share one of the stories that I found really quite important in my life. And this is the story of Rumpelstiltskin retold for a gay audience. Once there was a young man named Stephen who, when he turned 18, was brought by his parents to live with his uncle the miller. The miller had never married. Stephen's parents had a feeling their son was not going to marry either, and they hoped the miller might finish their son's education and show him how to get on in the world in ways they couldn't. Well, the miller had always been fond of his nephew, and he was happy to take him under his wing. During the day, Stephen worked in the mill and got plenty of exercise, hauling heavy bags of grain and flour. In the evenings, the miller took him to coffee houses and the theatre and gallery openings, when Stephen met his miller's friends. Everybody liked him, and it was a pleasant life. Now, the miller was a good man, but he had one failing, and that was that he couldn't resist bragging. He'd brag about anything, and it didn't matter whether it was true or not. If somebody behind him at the concert had said their suit cost an arm and a leg, the miller would turn around in his seat and claim that the one that he had cost him 2 members of his family. Or if a man ahead of him in the line at the market told him about his dog who fetched the morning paper, the miller would wait impatiently and then describe the dog that he owned, a dog who was able to write a gossip column and was whiz at typesetting besides. It was like a fever that came over him, and everyone who knew the miller, they just rolled their eyes and let him talk. One day, the miller was down at the mill chatting with 2 old friends. The 3 of them were watching Stephen clean the millstones. After a while, the first friend remarked, "I've got a nephew myself, and that boy, he can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear." The second friend said, "Oh, that's nothing. I've got a nephew who can make a mountain out of a molehill." Well, the miller couldn't let this pass. "My nephew Stephen," he declared, "can turn shit into gold." Now, the king just happened to be passing the mill on his afternoon walk. He stuck his head in the doorway and said to the miller, "In that case, have your nephew come to my castle tonight at 7. The miller bowed and said, "Yes, your majesty." His 2 friends bowed as well, but they grinned at the fix their friend had gotten himself into. In his youth, the king had been a ferocious warrior, and before he settled down, he'd slain every giant, troll, and dragon in the kingdom. Now his son, who was known throughout the kingdom as the Angry Prince, he was possessed with the same fiery spirit, but there was no more enemies to subdue. The king was beginning to worry that when it came time for him to pass the crown on to his son, the Angry Prince, with no other channel for his natural aggressions, what would take them out of his subjects and be a real tyrant? Already he had heard murmurings against the prince up at the castle. "Oh, he really dumped on me this morning," the servant-at-arms complained. "The prince always hands everyone a ration of shit," the duke observed to the count. "He's such an asshole," the scullery boy bitched to a page. But when the king heard the miller say he had a nephew who could turn shit into gold, he thought he may have found the answers to his problems. That night, at 6:45, the miller and Stephen stood on the front step of the castle. "Uncle, what are we going to do?" Stephen fretted. "You know I can't turn shit into gold, or anything for that matter." The miller patted Stephen on the shoulder with great confidence. "That's not a thing to worry about," he said. "You're smart and you're cute and everybody likes you. You'll think of something." Then he rapped the big brass knocker and hurried off as quickly as he could. A footman in livery answered the door, and Stephen explained that he was on his way before the king. The footman let him in and brought him over to the major domo. He straightened Stephen's collar and escorted him to the chamberlain. The chamberlain gave Stephen's hair a quick brushing and introduced him to the Minister of Protocol, who thought the shine on his shoes wasn't quite up to the occasion, but there really wasn't time to do anything about it, and they'd just have to hope for the best. Pages and men-at-arms and courtiers with nothing to do after dinner drifted over as well, and when it was judged that the crowd around him was suitably large, Stephen was escorted to the throne room and presented to the king. "Everybody leave, except Stephen," the king commanded, clapping his hands, and everybody did. The king pushed his crown back, rubbed the red mark it left on his forehead, and smiled. "Stephen," he said, "I've heard great things about you." "Aren't rumours terrible things, Your Majesty?" Stephen asked hopefully. "Now, don't be modest," the king said. "Let's take a little walk. I'd like to show you something." He stepped down off his throne, tucked his hand into the crook of Stephen's elbows. "Do you work out?" he asked, and the two of them left the throne room. They climbed an enormous white staircase, walked down some corridors, and arrived in the part of the castle where the nobility had their sleeping quarters. At last they came to a suite of rooms with a gold crown over the door. Two servants stood on either side of the door, bowing and opening it for them. But as he passed between them, Stephen couldn't help noticing that one had a bandaged nose and the other a black eye. Inside the room was a ruin. Furniture was smashed. It looked as if somebody had punched several holes in the walls with his fist, and a love seat had been stuffed into the fireplace and halfway up the chimney. "My son's room," the king said sadly. "Very nice," Stephen said, as politely as he could. "No, don't be tactful," the king said. "It was a nice room, but now it's, well, my boy, if you pardon my French, shit. There's not much sense replacing anything because he'll just do it again." He sighed and shook his head. "Do you like it here at the castle, Stephen? If you could see your way clear to help us out with your special gift, we'd love to have you come live with us here. Maybe you could be my son's companion. He's a good-looking boy, and I think you'd like him if he doesn't kill you. And unless you truly know how to turn shit into gold, I'm afraid that's just what he will do. But why am I taking up your time? You probably want to get right to work. Good luck, boy, and with every faith in the world is in you." He clapped Stephen on the shoulder and went out, closing the door behind him. "What am I going to do now?" Stephen groaned, not expecting an answer, but he was alone in the room. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the overturned wastebasket, and a funny little man crawled out, stood up, and dusted himself off. His tiny biker's cap, his tiny little boots, as well as a tiny motorcycle jacket, body harness and chaps. They were all made of black leather. He took off his tiny mirrored sunglasses and tucked them into his pocket. "Hello, Stephen," said the little man. "Looks like you've got a problem." "I have to turn shit into gold," agreed the unhappy Stephen, "and I don't know how." "I do," claimed the little man, "and I can show you how to do it too." "Can you really?" asked Stephen. "Oh, absolutely. It's what I do. Show you how in 5 seconds, 10 at the most. What will you give me?" I don't really have anything," Stephen confessed. "What would you want?" "Your happiness." "Excuse me?" "All of it." Stephen began to think that perhaps the little man wasn't as friendly as he seemed. The little man saw him hesitate and quickly said, "No payment for an entire year, and no one's going to offer you better terms than that." They didn't really sound like such great terms to Stephen, but he reflected that if he didn't accept them, he'd lose all of his happiness that very night, and his life as well. Then too, a year was a long time, and anything could happen before the little man's payment was due, so they shook hands on it. Actually, the little man was only able to shake the tip of Stephen's finger, but he did have a remarkably strong grip. "All right," Stephen said, massaging his finger, "show me how to turn this shit into gold." "Oh, this stuff?" the little man asked, making a face. "No, all of this will have to go into the dumpster out the back. Now listen, when the angry prince comes in and finds you in his room, he is going to throw a fit and he'll want to fight with you." "Then I'll fight him back," replied Stephen, who kept in pretty good shape carrying bags of grain from the mill. "No, no, no," cried the little man. "You're not listening. He's not the angry baron. He's not the angry count. He's not the angry telephone repairman, for heaven's sake. He's the angry prince, the king's son. You can't oppose him." "I see," Stephen said, nodding. "So, when he comes in, I won't fight him. I'll let him do all of the fighting." "No, no, no," shrieked the little man, who seemed to have a very low threshold for frustration. "That won't work either. If he starts fighting you, he'll kill you. Remember, he's the king's son, and you're what it is now, a miller's nephew." "Then what should I do?" shouted Stephen, getting a little frustrated with himself. "Hey," warned the little man, "don't you ever raise your voice to me. What you do, Stephen, is simple. You get him to spank you." "Oh," said Stephen. Oh, right. Oh, of course." The little man was right. It was simple. So simple that Stephen wanted to kick himself for not having thought of it on his own before agreeing to the unpleasant bargain with the little man. But there wasn't any time for kicking. From the hallway came the sound of an angry voice, followed by several slaps and punches. The little man winked at him, stamped his tiny boot, and disappeared. Then the door slammed open and the angry prince stormed into the room. "What are you doing here?" he roared as soon as he saw Stephen. He would have been a very handsome young man, but he was knotted up with tension. "I'm sorry," Stephen said in his mildest voice. "I won't do it again." This made the angry prince pause. Generally, he found that people responded to his rages with the most irritating excuses or with rages of their own, even more irritating, and he was momentarily at a loss as to how he should proceed. He rallied himself. "Well, you shouldn't have done it in the first place," he shouted. "You're right," Stephen shouted back. "Why don't you spank me?" "Really?" said the angry prince. No one's ever made such a suggestion to him before, and he could feel some of the tension starting to leave his neck and shoulders. Stephen gave him his most charming smile, and that was a very charming smile indeed. "Really?" he said. Meanwhile, the king waited in the hall, in a state of somewhat apprehension. He wasn't lessened by the nature of the sounds coming from within his son's room. It seemed that angry prince was venting his rage on Miller's nephew, though, oddly enough, Stephen wasn't crying for help. "Well," sighed the king to himself, "that's what happens to people who claim that they could turn shit into gold when they really couldn't." He had a servant bring him a comfortable chair and settled down to wait for whatever the morning brought. It was almost noon when the door finally opened, and to the king's amazement, his son and Stephen walked out together, arm in arm. Stephen looked radiant, and the angry prince could hardly be recognised. He was so relaxed, he actually smiled. The king peeked into the room. The broken furniture hadn't been turned into gold, but that was a little disappointing. But when he saw his son pass between the doormen without striking either of them, he said to himself, "Well, something certainly changed." So Stephen came to live at the castle in a suite of rooms that communicated with the angry princes, who for the first time in his life began to be known by his first name, Eric. And for a year, Stephen's life was delightful. But one night, as he was doing his sit-ups, the wastebasket in the corner suddenly tipped over and out crawled the little man. Stephen had completely forgotten about him and wasn't happy to be reminded. "Hello, Stephen," the little man said, dusting himself off. "Here I am for your happiness." Well, Stephen had gotten used to being happy. It seemed to him, though, that the little man had told him the secret of turning shit into gold. Stephen had really done it himself. So he offered the little man jewels, or a position at the court, or a lifetime membership in the gym of his choice. Actually, anything else that he wanted instead. But nothing would satisfy him. So at last, Stephen shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to walk away empty-handed because you can't have my happiness." "Really?" the little man remarked. "Guess what, Stephen? You're HIV positive. See you around." "No," Stephen cried, but something inside him said yes, and he knew that the little man had taken away all of his happiness. Stephen begged and pleaded with the little man, who seemed to enjoy that. When he'd enjoyed it enough, though, he said, "Well, Stephen, I can't just give you back your happiness. I'd love to, but it's just not the way these things are done. However, I could make you a special one-time only offer. If you can tell me in these next 3 nights, 3 guesses per night, why you're positive, what that means about you as a person, I'll give you back enough happiness to live a good life and we'll be quits. But if you can't tell me, then I keep your happiness and I take you as well. Make your mind up quickly, I'm very busy." Stephen wasn't happy with the offer. He wasn't happy with anything at the moment, but he had a chance to change that. So he held out his finger to the little man to shake. "All right," he said, rubbing his finger. "I'm positive because God thinks I'm a bad person? Does sex equal death? Too many poppers? I like those guesses," chuckled the little man. "I like them because they're wrong." Then he stamped his little boot and disappeared. The next night was the same story. A plague created by homophobic scientists, Stephen guessed, clutching at straws. How about chronic feelings of worthlessness having an impact on my immune system? Nature's way of telling me that I'm not what she had in mind? The little man beamed at him. "Oh, you're doing just fine," he said, shaking his head. "Don't bother packing a suitcase tomorrow night, Stephen. You won't need anything where I'm going to take you." He stamped his little boot and disappeared. Stephen was getting desperate. He sent for the only person he could think of who might be able to help him, his uncle. When the miller showed up, a little grumpy because it was so late, Stephen told him everything. "You see, Uncle," he concluded, "if I don't find out what having this virus means about me, I'm lost. I need you to go throughout the kingdom, talking to everyone you meet. Surely there must be somebody who knows the answer." "Nephew, there isn't a thing to worry about," the miller assured him. "I'll handle everything." He didn't wait for the morning to come, but set out for the castle immediately. Stephen waited all the next day. He was unable to eat, unable to concentrate on anything. Finally, long after dark, the miller stumbled back in. He threw himself down on a chair. "I'm bushed," he groaned. "I must have talked to every single person in the kingdom today. My feet are killing me." "I'm sorry," Stephen said, trying to be patient. "We'll get you some Epsom salts. But did you find an answer for me?" "Well," the miller admitted, "no." "No?" Stephen cried. "No one could tell you anything at all?" "Oh, everyone had an opinion," the miller told him, waving his hands as if brushing away flies. "This one thought it was a punishment from God. That one thought it meant that you didn't love yourself enough. You wouldn't believe some of the things I heard, but nobody knew." He shook his head in disgust, but then he brightened up. "But I saw the most interesting thing. Maybe this will take your mind off your problems. As I was cutting through the forest just now, I saw a light up ahead of me. What could this have been at this time of night, I asked myself. So I crept up to it, and what do you think? I found a huge bonfire with a little man in leather dancing around it, singing away at the top of his lungs and just having a wonderful time. Now, how did his song go? Listen to this." And the miller leaned forward and whispered, "Last night wrong, and the night before, he's only got 3 more guesses more. Tonight I take him fair and square. It's just something that was there." Amusing little song, isn't it? "Uncle, it's the answer," Stephen cried, hugging the miller. He had no sooner hidden him behind the drapes when the wastebasket fell over and out came the little man. "Well, we're going to have such fun tonight, Stephen," he cried, his eyes twinkling merrily. "Oh yes, let's get your 3 wrong guesses over with fast, because you and I have got a long way to go." "Let's," said Stephen in an agreeable manner. Does being positive mean I'm loyal in my friendships, honest and dedicated to a personal growth?" The little man stopped grinning. No," he said. "Well, then does it mean I'm creative, exciting, glamorous and courageous?" Stephen asked. "What are you talking about?" the little man growled, his eyes narrowing. "It doesn't have anything to do with those things." "Well, in that case," Stephen said, leaning down and straightening the little man's leather jacket, "it must not mean anything about me at all. It's just a virus I was exposed to. A terrible one, but just a virus." And he pinched the little man's cheek. "What?" shrieked the little man, his face turning as black as his outfit. "What? You? What did you say? What did you say to me after all I've done for you?" He glared at Stephen as if he'd like to do what he thought he was just going to do at that very moment. And he got his boots and he stamped them. But it went right through the floor and stuck there. This made the little man so furious that he gripped it with both hands and yanked it up with all his might. Unfortunately for him, he pulled so hard that he tore himself in two, and that was the end. As for Stephen, he got back more than enough happiness to live a life good and happy with his prince. When the king found out the part the miller had played in all of this, he was so impressed with him that he invited the miller to come and live in the castle as well. And that's where the 4 of them are now, happy as ever. Guys, I've always really liked this story, and I hope you found it interesting. Today is World AIDS Day, and I think it's very important that we do remember that AIDS is just that. It's simply a virus. It's not a reflection on the person who's living with it. So we need to support and care and look after our friends who are living with HIV. I hope that you have found this wonderful, and I ask you to share it forward. See you guys. Bye.